All right, let's talk about constructivist theories and models of literacy. I am Dr. Shay Kirchhoff from UMSL. From a constructivist view, reading is an experience-based, hypothesis-driven cognitive process of generating coherent meaning. So let's break that down. In this sense, readers are constructing meaning. So think about taking the pieces of information and putting them together. And reading is an experience-based, meaning that they're using their previous experiences and the knowledge of those experiences to help them make meaning of the words that they are seeing. Hypothesis-driven means that readers are taking their best guess of what the words are saying, and then they're continuing to read to see if their best guess is making sense as they continue to read. And if so, then they have successful meaning making. And if not, then they have to go back and either adapt what they previously thought about that topic. For example, if you think about when children are learning language and all fruit are called apples, right? They learn apple, and so then they see a pear and they call that apple. That's their hypothesis. And then when we introduce the word pear, they have to adapt their mental model of what an apple is and categorize pear and apple as something under the umbrella of pear. So in reading, we're also making hypotheses and then looking to see if we need to adapt our mental models to include what we read, or did we misread and we need to reread, and that's all in our mind. So it's a cognitive process of generating coherent meaning, so the meaning that makes sense as the whole text and not just at the word level. So when we're talking about active construction of knowledge, this is a constructivist theory of learning. So this is opposed to the banking model, as Freire calls it. We're not just pouring knowledge into students' heads and they passively receive it. This is opposed to other cognitive models where the word level reading is then brought to the sentence level and then brought to the paragraph level. And then that is what drives meaning. It is actively the reader bringing their knowledge, their cultural background, and the experiences they have to bear to make meaning of what they read. So Catherine Snow and colleagues, funded by the Rand Corporation in 2002, went to find a definition of comprehension in reading. So really getting at that meaning making. And they found, after a synthesis of the research literature out there, that reading involves the reader, yes, and what's happening in the reader's mind, but it also is found in the text. So what is the text? Does the reader have the same cultural background as the author? Does the author make assumptions about the reader's knowledge that the reader may not have? Also, the sociocultural and historical context of when the text was written and when the reader is reading it. In that way, you can think about perhaps you read a poem when you were in elementary school and you interpreted it one way and made meaning of it in one way. And then you go back and you read it now as an adult and you have a different level of experience to bring to the poem and you read it in another way. You bring a different interpretation to it, and both are valid. It's just that you as the reader are a different person. And then there's also the activity. So why are we reading it? What's the purpose for reading? Is this something that we're just reading to skim, to get the gist? Is this something that we really need to understand in order to evaluate the information? Do we need to read closely? Is this something that we're reading for fun? And so Louise Rosenblatt talks about different stances we bring to reading. We can have an efferent stance where we are reading to learn, and we are paying attention to the facts and the information, and we need to remember them. Or we could read from an aesthetic stance, reading to appreciate the craft of writing, reading to find pleasure and joy in the experience of literacy. And so those all work together to help readers comprehend text, or are all influential in readers making meaning. And so if we take Duke and Cartwright's active view of reading, they are saying that that model is a reader model. So they are saying that reading is also impacted by text, task, and sociocultural context. But they're really honing in on the reader part and talking about how active self-regulation is important, the executive function skills, and the cognitive flexibility, motivation and engagement, the ability to bring a strategy to the task and use the strategy to make meaning, as well as what we typically hear in science of reading discussions, the word recognition and the language comprehension components, and the bridging components of concepts of print and fluency and vocabulary knowledge. All of that leads together to reading. Another way to think about how our minds work when we're reading from a constructivist view is schema. So Anderson, in the chapter in the book Theoretical Models and Processes of Literacy, 2019, gives us this example sentence. The notes were sour because the seam split. Now, I could read all of those words. I could read them fluently. I even could put the correct intonation or emphasis. But that doesn't mean I can make sense of this. I need something else in order to comprehend the sentence. We need context and background knowledge. So, when I learned that the context of this sentence is a paragraph about a bagpipe concert, now this makes sense. Okay, notes in this case are notes probably coming from the bagpipe. Sour isn't a taste, but a sound. And the seam split. So bagpipes, I know, are a wind instrument. I have that background knowledge because I was in band growing up and I played the flute. And so the air that the musician blows is what's making the notes. So if a seam split, I'm guessing that's the seam of the bag. And that means that the air wasn't coming out producing the notes as it should have. Now, if someone doesn't have the background knowledge of what a bagpipe is, that it is an instrument, they might know what concerts are, and so they can infer that a bagpipe is a sort of instrument. But they may not know what the seam split means, because if they don't understand what a bagpipe is and that it's an instrument, they might not be able to make meaning from this sentence. And so that is how the theory of schema helps us understand the complexity that happens when we are comprehending text. text. So when we read, we have the knowledge. If we have the knowledge needed to make meaning, we're given the context. That context is one in which is a context that maps onto our cultural background in the way that the author intended it to be understood, then we can comprehend successfully. Now, sometimes a different and cultural interpretation still can make sense with the words that are given. And so in that way, a reading isn't wrong, but we can find cultural clashes when we talk about there only being one way to interpret a text, as we often find in testing situations. So that's something to keep in mind. When we're reading, if what we read causes dissonance, meaning that it's not mapping onto what we already believe or what we have experienced, then we can either modify what we once believed. For example, that all fruit were called apples. We can modify to now know, no, there's different names for different fruits. And we can create a new mental model to account for the new knowledge. Sometimes it's just a slight tuning where we're just adapting a little bit. Sometimes we don't have the knowledge about the topic that we're reading about, and we have to develop a new mental model to make sense of it. So schema relates to reading in 6 ways, and perhaps more, but this is what the research has been able to illuminate thus far. Schema provides ideational scaffolding for assimilating text information. Okay, what does that mean? So think about scaffolding in construction. That is helping us to be able to put the blocks and bricks where they go. So it's a place to connect the context of the reading with prior knowledge of that context. It provides a slot in our mind to put the information into. Number 2, it facilitates selective allocation of attention. This means that it helps us know what to pay attention to. If we are reading to learn, then we're going to pay attention to the information and facts. And if we are reading to follow a process, then we're going to pay attention to the steps. And our understanding of the context helps us know what to pay attention to. So when we're reading a menu, we can use our previous experiences with menu to know that there are probably different sections, and we need to read in order to make a choice from each section if we wish. So there's an appetizer section, and we might look at that to choose one. And then there's a menu, and we would read that to choose. There's a entrees, and we would read that to make a choice. So that helps us pay attention to what's important. This also leads to facilitating editing and summarizing. So the selective attention then helps when we are editing our writing to take away unnecessary details, or to summarize what we just read in order to remember what we learned. The 4th function is it allows orderly searches of memory. So schema, I like to think of is a mind map of knowledge. Think of a web of the knowledge in your brain, and the knowledge is connected in categories. And so we can go to that category and then pull the information. For example, our brain stores all of the names of our family members together in one place. That's why sometimes we call family members by the wrong name, but our brain is reaching to that part of the brain to pull the information. And this happens when we're reading also. So using that menu example again, we can put the information of the entrees in the entree section. Then the next day, if someone asks, so what did you have at the restaurant last night? You can use that schema to also help you remember. So let's see. Okay, so first probably was an appetizer. Yes, we had this appetizer, and then I had this entree, and it helps you remember too. 5, enables inferential elaboration. This is really important in reading because there is a lot of inferences that happen in order to make comprehension, in order to comprehend a text. So reading between the lines, understanding that if the text said the mother gave the son a look, then we would bring our past experiences in order to understand that that is probably saying that the mother is not approving of what the boy is doing. It doesn't say that in the text, but we use our previous knowledge and our prior experiences to read between the lines. And then schema also permits inferential reconstruction. Like I was giving the example of the menu. If we don't remember exactly, we rely on our knowledge of the context to infer what would have made sense in that context. Anderson points out this quote. I'm going to read it. A critical issue is whether cultural variation within the United States could be a factor in different reading comprehension. Minority children could have a handicap if stories, texts, and test items presuppose a cultural perspective that the children do not share. So here's an example of how culture can influence our interpretation and our comprehension of text. He plunked down $8 at the window. She tried to give him $4, but he refused to take it. So when they got inside, she bought him a large bag of popcorn. Now, depending on your cultural knowledge, this could be about a young couple on a date at the movies. I see the words he and she, window, that makes me think of a ticket window, popcorn. Popcorn in my schema is connected to movies. Movies are a very popular place for dating in my culture. And so I can also continue to elaborate on my inferences. Maybe it's not a date. Maybe she doesn't want it to be a date and she's trying to pay in order to show that this is just about being friends. Or I can bring a feminist view to this and read it about it. It is a date, but it's about equality. So there's different ways to interpret based on my stance as a reader and my cultural context. In a culture where dating is not part of the culture, maybe there are arranged marriages or courting, or in cultures where movie theaters are not really part of the cultural experience, this could be interpreted differently. So I used this example when I was doing a workshop in Belize, and the participants there in that cultural context interpreted this as a mother and son going to a fair, and he was showing respect to his mother by paying, but as the mother, she didn't want him to have to spend his own money. So she, that's why she was trying to pay. And having popcorn at a fair would be a very typical cultural context, something that mothers and sons and family members would do to celebrate a holiday or something fun. So this interpretation still makes sense based on the facts provided in the text. But if the question the teacher asks is something related to dating is not going to make sense with the person whose cultural interpretation was that this was a family event, right? And so there's not a right or a wrong interpretation to text when it comes to bringing one's cultural background to it, as long as it makes sense with the facts, the information provided. So Anderson also asserts that children do not spontaneously integrate what they are reading with what they already know. This means that special attention should be paid to preparation for reading. This is where we can use activating prior knowledge and building background knowledge. So some ways to do this are to preview the text, provide an anticipation guide, do a picture walk and make predictions based on the cover and the pictures. With older children, you can make predictions based on the title. I find oftentimes that students do not preview the text and they don't even read the title. And often the title is what gives us the biggest clue about what the text is about. So making sure to call attention to the title, making a prediction about what we think it's going to be based on the title or the images we can see. KWL, the K part, what do you know, is activating prior knowledge. If you do it individually, it's activating that child's prior knowledge. But you can see down below, building background knowledge. If you do that with an entire class, then the class can learn from each other. So they can learn from their peers to build that background knowledge. Same as a whole class mind map, just putting the main topic on the board, drawing a circle around it, having them add to the web of what they already know. Providing an advanced organizer, so that can also help students activate their knowledge of that kind of text, that text structure, and give them a slot in their schema to put the information as they read. Another way to build background knowledge is to preview the vocabulary, making sure to say it, see it, and provide the definition of it before reading. Another constructivist theory that moves beyond schema, builds on schema theory, is the construction integration model of reading by Kinch. And in the construction integration model of reading, readers are creating mental representations of the text. So according to this model, that is what comprehension is. And reading the words on the page or on the screen are all in service of creating a coherent representation in the mind. So the way that Kinch, who was a linguist, describes the reading process, he describes that there is normal reading that is automatic and that doesn't require a lot of effort. But it's when the normal reading breaks down that we have to apply effort that is really important to think about as teachers. So the effortful, active processes that we can analyze, we can break down into the components and help children as they are learning to read to develop skills and grow as they become better readers. Okay, so Kinch talks about 3 different parts of reading. One part he calls propositions, and this is a word to describe the different ideas in a text. So example, there is a word bark, and does the word bark, is that a proposition of the sound that a dog makes, or is that a proposition of what covers the outside of a tree? Okay, so the word is bark, but what is the word representing? Is this and then thinking more globally about the text. Is this text about trees or is this text about dogs? Okay, so those are the propositions in the text, the ideas in the text. What are the words are there, but they're representing a meaning of something. So he gives the example, the little boy chopped wood. There's three main propositions. There's boy, there's chop, and there's wood. He also talks about microstructure and macrostructure. And so this is how the ideas relate to each other. So microstructure could be syntax, the order of the words, like subject, verb, object in English. That would be a typical way that the ideas or the propositions would be related to each other at the sentence level. And then the sentence level comes together to see how these ideas are relating to each other. At the sentence level, we build on sentences to make paragraphs or sections. But we also have the macro structure. And in order to be able to understand the macro structure, we need to look at the organizational structure of the text as a whole. So when we teach narrative, whether fiction or nonfiction, a picture book story of a fairy tale or a biography, we typically have one structure, and that is the narrative arc. It's also called story grammar. So we have a beginning that introduces the setting and the characters. We have the middle, which is the conflict or the problem, the complication. And then we have the end, the resolution, how the situation is resolved. In informational text, there's a variety of different ways that those are structured. And so as humans are natural storytellers, students come into classrooms with out of school knowledge of stories and how stories work. Informational texts, because there are so many different kinds of structures, it's important that we explicitly teach these macro structures types of texts. When we think about information texts and argument texts, they might be structured as problem solution. They might be a descriptive text that's spatial, so starting at the outside of the tree and working in, or from the top to the roots. There might be a chronological text, so a history text might start in the 1800s, and then 1900s, and then the 2000s. Sequence we often find as process texts, or like a recipe. You would do this first and then second. But when we think about macro structures, context also matters, right? So the macro structure of a recipe in a cooking blog, you know that you have to scroll through the top to get to the sequence, right? And so the macro structure of a recipe on a blog is that there is some storytelling at the top, getting the reader's interest, making place for ads to monetize it, and then what the reader really wants, those ingredient lists and the steps are down at the bottom. In informational text, we also encounter cause and effect and compare and contrast. If you think about journalism, we have the inverted pyramid. So having knowledge about different macro structures of text is prior knowledge we can then bring to the reading to help us comprehend, to construct a meaning from the text. Kinch also talks about different levels of meaning making. So thinking about an onion, and as you have the surface level, but then as you peel the onion, you have layers and layers. So the surface level in the construction integration model are the words in the text. Okay, so you read a book, and what was the book about? It was about the different sounds that dogs make. There were the words sounds and dogs in the text. Those were the propositions, right? The main ideas. So if you ask students what were the main ideas in that text, and they give you the exact words that were in the text, that could be a surface level. And it's important to help students get that first. Without the surface level meaning, without knowing what the words in the text mean, it's really hard to move to the text-based level of meaning and the deeper level of meaning. So the text-based level is constructing what the text says. So there's the semantic underpinning, the meaning making, based on the micro and macro structures, how the words combine to make meaning of the text. And so this is how the ideas relate to each other, how they're connected to each other. And this is the basic meaning of the text, where we can see that students are entering a text-based level of comprehension when they can paraphrase it, when they can put it in their own words or use different words. And then the deeper level, so we move from constructing, just building those ideas, to integrating those ideas, integrating the ideas with prior knowledges and experiences to create a coherent mental representation. And I would say that the constructing and the integrating, that this is an interaction model where they are happening sometimes one and then the other, sometimes text-based and then deeper level. That would be bottom up from the text to the deeper, but also top down. So our prior knowledges and experiences helping us to make sense of what the text is saying. And they can happen in either direction or both simultaneously. So that makes this an interaction model of reading. Kinch calls this deeper level that when readers are making mental representations, he calls those situational models. Just flip those words around, models of the situation represented in the text. And when we're talking about bringing the prior knowledge and experiences in integration with the ideas in the text, we're talking about knowledge of text, so print concepts, as well as knowledge of story grammar and knowledge of, for example, take a research article that it will represent a problem first, and then show a gap in the research, and then put forth a method to fill the gap and the results. So it is a specific type of problem solution. And we use knowledge of text as well as knowledge of the world and the ideas, the topic in the text, the content itself. So we're integrating the content knowledge, the knowledge about text and language with the ideas represented in the text. And when we make mental representations, they can be verbal, they can be images, they can be both. And so this is where graphic organizers, mind maps that allow for words and pictures, all of these help us to be able to make visible what students have in their minds. Graphic organizers and mind maps with words and images help students to integrate the ideas and also help us as teachers to make visible their thinking. And Kinch as well draws on schema theory when he says that what sort of situational model readers construct depends very much on their goals in reading the text, as well as the amount of relevant prior knowledge they have. So thinking about the cultural background or the content knowledge that they have ahead of time, or the text knowledge they have ahead of time, will come to bear in the situation model they create. And this also pulls in Rosenblatt's ideas of the efferent stance. So are we reading this to learn, or are we reading this for pleasure? And so that will also make a difference in the kind of representations and the level of detail of the representations that we make. So let's relate the constructivist theories and models of literacy to practice. So here are some practices that aid reading comprehension. So good readers set a purpose for reading. They make predictions. They engage in questioning, connecting, sequencing, summarizing, inferring, reasoning, and they are constantly comprehension monitoring. So they have a metacognitive awareness of when they are reading automatically. And then if there is a problem, then they stop and start problem solving. They use their metacognitive strategies to maybe reread, and then that's enough, or to slow down their reading, and that's enough. And when it's not, then we can draw on the construction integration model to help us think about what other strategies we can use. So going over to the strategy side, as teachers, we can provide students an anticipation guide. This is where we ask students their thoughts or beliefs before reading, and then they read, and then they see if their thoughts or beliefs changed. So this helps them kind of activate the schema of the topic or the ideas, what the propositions, the ideas in the text are going to be, and then also helps them integrate it with their knowledge and their ideas as they revisit them at the end to see if anything maybe changed. How did they add to their schema or modify their schema? Picture walk, or previewing the text. And this is something that we can teach students. We can gradually release the responsibility so that they're doing it independently. With older students, I call it previewing the text. So, look through it. What are the words in bold? Is there a definition on the side or in the glossary? What are the pictures? What is the title? What are the subheadings? All of that helps, according to constructivist theories, helps get our mind ready and give us the surface level as well as the macro structure level of knowledge that we'll need. There's also questioning the author and QUIP and KWL, all of these kind of comprehension strategies that help us interact with the text as we're reading, making connections like text to self, text to text, text to world. Again, we're integrating what we're reading with our knowledge outside of the text. Storyboarding, graphic organizers, windows of the mind, those are all strategies that help the reader to visualize. So a storyboard would be the sequence of the story, the beginning, middle, end, where students draw pictures of what happened. They can do it as they're reading or after reading. Graphic organizers is the same. Windows of my mind, you draw a window with like 4 panes, and then just 4 images of what the reader thought about. So this works even if it's not a sequence or chronological text. It's just windows into the mind. So it's just a way of thinking about what you learned or took from the text and representing it visually. But there's a lot more. So there's more comprehension strategies, there's more fix-up strategies, and you can Google those and find a lot, really. Some of the critiques of constructivist theory, There's a critique of any kind of cognitive or mind-based, individual-based theories that one size does not fit all. So a critical theorist, Andretti, says, and I quote, expansion of our collective capacity to hold space for multiplicity, plurality, complexity, uncertainty, ambivalence, paradoxes, tensions, and failure. That, perhaps this theory isn't for everyone. Maybe it describes some people, but it doesn't describe all people. Or maybe it's helpful in some contexts, but not all contexts. Another critique is that these theories ignore systems of power. So they are considering the micro and macro structure of text, but what about the micro and macro systems that contribute to outcomes that make students more or less motivated to read because of the relationships they have with the person in power that is asking them to engage in activity, or how the micro and macro systems contribute to their ability for their brain to focus attention, and to bring in those self-regulatory skills. And the macro power relationships regarding race and gender, religion, ability, and more. There's also a Goldilocks critique. Some say that constructivist theories rely too much on top-down. So we front load students with all of this prior knowledge, all this background knowledge they're going to need. Here is the vocabulary. Here's what those words mean. And then we're taking away the problem solving. So then students are used to encountering normal reading where it's automatic and they are able to make meaning. And when they come to a text where they run into a problem with comprehension, they don't have the strategies because they haven't practiced that. And so having students grapple with the text and to make meaning based on context clues and using metacognition and fix-up strategies, that is, critics would say, important as well. And then others say it doesn't pay enough attention to cultural and social context and the background and experiences that readers are bringing to bear to a text. So there's critiques on both sides of some say too much, some say too little. But overall, I find that the constructivist theories align for teachers who have a constructivist learning stance and can be helpful when we want to think about comprehension.